Welcome to a journey back in time, as we're about to venture into the hidden pages of history, exploring a wild side of the Wild West that has long been shrouded in mystery and secrecy. Get ready to saddle up as we embark on this wild escapade of 10 strange facts about what sex was like in the Wild West. Number 10. Gender roles were fluid and homosexuality was no big thing. When we think about the Wild West, we often picture those tough, rugged cowboys who embodied classic manliness. Imagine a cowboy on his trusty horse, racing to save a distressed lady tied to train tracks. The whole deal with spitting tobacco, loading guns, and living life on the edge. But here's the kicker. The way cowboys saw homosexuality back then might catch you off guard. In Wild West times, they didn't really slap labels like gay or straight on folks. It was more like, hey, be you and do your thing, without society breathing down your neck. So, get this. I found this super interesting interview called Homos on the Range, How Gay Was the West, with Peter Boag from the University of Colorado at Boulder. He wrote this awesome book called Same-Sex Affairs, and guess what? Back then, same-sex stuff wasn't the big no-no it is nowadays. In places where ladies were as rare as a unicorn sighting, think mining camps packed with dudes. Some folks flipped the bird to traditional gender roles. They'd take on women's roles for both snuggles and household chores, totally flipping the script. In the Old West, guys just went with the flow when it came to love and companionship. They showed that human connections are way bigger than labels and all that judgment junk. Here's a real mind bender. Being gay wasn't all hush-hush like you'd think. Actually, the toughest-nails cowboys in the West thought same-sex relationships were as normal as moseying along on a horse. Since women were in shorter supply than gold nuggets, it wasn't a big deal for guys to be, well, guys together. Cowboys and miners even teamed up in what they called bachelor marriages. Crazy, right? Number 9. America's oldest profession was in full swing. All right, folks, let's dive into a wild ride through the Old West, and trust me, we're not skipping any juicy details. Brace yourselves for a look into the world of sex workers back in the day. Yeah, you heard me right. We're talking about the ladies who played a big role in shaping the vibe of every town and city in that era. Women were more than just a colorful thread in the social fabric of the Old West. They gave us a sneak peek into the tangled web of society and money. Most of these gals were young, usually under 30, and not big on book smarts. Illiteracy was kind of their thing. But here's the twist. They came from all walks of life, immigrants from every corner of the globe. And get this, they were judged by more than just looks. Factors like where they came from and their background added layers to how they were seen. It's like they brought a whole buffet of diversity to the table. Just like the unsung heroes of the Wild West, the miners and rail workers, these ladies were hustlers in their own right. They were the capitalist pros, making things tick in the towns that were popping up all over. Imagine being in a mostly guy-driven town and having these gals around, making things feel a bit more normal and cozy. Now, here's the bummer. Even though they were such a big deal, they got lost in the shadows of history. We've all heard about the big shots of the time, but these unsung heroes, not so much. Historians and researchers are now on a mission to uncover these hidden stories and give them the spotlight they deserve. Now, back to the women who called the Wild West home. Many were indeed working as prostitutes. But guess what? That wasn't always seen as a bad thing. Some places had the swankiest brothels in town, run by these boss ladies who had major influence. And when it came to pricing for some one-on-one time, you could snag a deal for as low as 25 cents, or maybe splurge a whole $1. Number 8. Privacy during the act? Think again. Imagine tiny houses where families squeezed into just one big room. Yeah, you heard me right. One room for everyone. And in case you're wondering, privacy wasn't exactly on the menu. So let's tackle the big question. How in the world did folks manage to find some alone time for intimacy when they were all crammed together? Well, hold on to your hats because we're about to unravel a history lesson. Way back in Europe, while the Old West was going all cowboy crazy, there was this thing called the Reformation. Influential folks like Martin Luther were all about carving out some space for private adult stuff. It was like a light bulb moment for privacy and intimate matters. But here's the twist. Out in the untamed West, your ability to lock down some privacy depended a lot on your bank account. Sadly, most folks settling in this rugged land didn't have cash to spare. Private rooms were about as rare as a four-leaf clover, leaving them without much of a choice. Picture this: adventure around every corner, struggles at every turn, and on top of it all, hardly any privacy. These pioneers were living life in a whole new way, and it wasn't all gunslingers and gold hunts. The stories of how they juggled intimacy into their cramped digs bring a whole new meaning to making it work. Can you believe that families shared the same bed? Yeah, you heard that right. Kids probably knew way more about where they came from than most modern kids do. This idea of splitting the private and public sides of life, it started making waves during the Reformation era. First, with the upper crust, who were used to fancy marriages in public. Slowly but surely, it trickled down to the regular folk. Of course, it's not like people never tried for some privacy before all this. But back then, things were totally different in terms of culture and what was considered normal. It's all about fitting in some loving amidst the chaos and sharing the same roof as your entire extended family. History sure knows how to keep us on our toes, right? Number 7. Birth control involved ingesting toxins. Picture this: a time of cool new ideas and shaking up the status quo. Yet the baby boom wasn't exactly booming. So what gives? Well, let's break it down. Sure, there were condoms around, but here's the kicker. They were like the luxury sports cars of contraception, priced through the roof. And that left a lot of people scratching their heads, looking for some alternative solutions to keep those storks at bay. People were whipping up these potions as a last-ditch effort to avoid pregnancies they didn't want. And let's not sugarcoat it, this wasn't a walk in the park. For the gutsy women who dabbled in these potions, it wasn't just about their careers or lifestyles being on the line. It was about their very lives. Giving birth back then was like a high-stakes adventure, and not the fun kind. Many women faced dangerous odds and tragically didn't make it through delivery. So you can imagine the kind of desperate choices they were facing. Women were stuck between pregnancies that could seriously put their lives in danger and going down a road of seriously sketchy substances to stop them. Choices had to be made, and they weren't easy. In the midst of all the liberating ideas swirling around, the reality check was harsh. Freedom was being pushed to its limits, and lives were hanging in the balance. Number 6. Crossdressing went both ways. So, get this. According to a rock star historian named Peter Boag, crossdressing was way more of a thing than we ever thought. And guess what? It wasn't just the ladies putting on men's clothes to break the mold. Nope, the guys were in on the action too. Picture this: a packed room at the University of Wyoming, where Professor Peter Boag was spilling the beans on the whole sexuality and gender scene back in the Wild West. And oh boy, did he drop a bombshell. So, you know how we've heard about fearless gals disguising themselves as men to grab opportunities they wouldn't normally get? Well, Boag dug up a whole bunch of stories about men rocking dresses and being all-out fabulous as women. In a world where the West's wild landscapes met some seriously unconventional ways of expressing yourself, these tales of cross-dressing in every direction painted a picture as vibrant as a desert sunset. Gender lines? Those things were more like scribbles in the sand. The Wild West was all about letting your identity flag fly, and these stories prove just that. Imagine thinking the Old West was all about rugged cowboys when it turns out that cross-dressing was as common as tumbleweeds. Boag, the history guru, says it wasn't some hush-hush secret. Nope, it was right there out in the open, like a saloon sign. So there you have it, friends. The Wild West was even wilder when it came to shaking up gender norms. Get ready to flip your perception of that cowboy era on its head. Number 5. Some things were too risque for cowboys. All right, now we're diving into some seriously intriguing stuff straight from the pages of Slumming, Sexual and Racial Encounters in American Nightlife, 1885 to 1940, written by the cool cat, Chad Heap, who's a big-shot associate professor over at George Washington University. All right, so picture this. Back in the day, oral pleasure was like this alluring yet kind of mysterious thing. Americans were curious, but they were also a bit cautious about diving into that zone. But here's the kicker. Even the folks you'd expect to be super open-minded about stuff, like sex workers, had their reservations when it came to this unconventional territory. Now, picture the scene. Society had all these lines drawn in the sand, and secret rendezvous were as common as tumbleweeds in a ghost town. Chad Heap's journey into this era is like shining a spotlight on a corner of American nightlife we rarely hear about. This was a time where pleasure met taboos head-on, like a wild dance-off. The crazy part? People had some seriously mixed feelings about oral pleasure. It's like desire and inhibition were doing this intricate tango, and Heaps got the front row seat to the show. Chad Heap's book takes us on a roller coaster ride through this intoxicating era, and let me tell you, it's a story that'll have you hanging onto every word. Number 4, intimacy language in the Old West. Now we're hopping on a linguistic DeLorean and cruising back to the Old West. And guess what? The way folks talked about love and intimacy back then was like a whole different universe compared to how we chat now. In this era, where the language was as rugged as those untamed landscapes, they had this crazy cool way of talking that's like a treasure trove of expressions. And here's the real kicker. They had a word, pie-rootin', that sounds like something straight out of a secret code book. It was their sneaky way of hinting at some private moments. Think about it. They didn't have emojis or texting lingo. Instead, they had these words that gave us a peek into the hidden corners of life back then. These phrases are like a secret key that unlocks doors to the Wild West's passionate side. It's all about desire mixed with a dash of hush-hush. While these terms might sound like they're from a different planet now, they're like little time capsules of the past. They show us how language was a reflection of what was okay and what was totally off limits. By digging into these old-timey phrases, we're getting a front row seat to the unspoken parts of Wild West life. Number 3, assault was rampant. Let me tell you this, things weren't all sunshine and rainbows for women back then. It was a tough reality, where women had really limited choices and were stuck in a subordinate spot in society. And here's the real kicker. Sexual assault was like this dark cloud hanging over everything. Survivors had it rough. They were left with almost no options to seek justice or even find comfort. It's a tough pill to swallow, but it's important we dive into this and understand it. Now, as we flip through the history books, we come across the words of Nancy Williams, a real champion for women's rights. She's a writer and crisis worker who's seen it all. She reminds us how far we've come in terms of technology, from steam engines to jet engines, and from outhouses to fancy indoor plumbing. But guess what? Progress in protecting women from sexual assault has been moving at a snail's pace. It's a wake-up call, really. Even as our world transforms and evolves, we can't forget the deep-seated problems that still affect the most vulnerable among us. The stories of women's struggles in the Old West call us to face history head-on, spark change, and create a future where justice and equality are as groundbreaking as the coolest tech gadgets. Speaking of which, let's talk numbers. It turns out the sexual assault situation back then wasn't all that different from now. Nancy Williams, with her wealth of experience, sheds light on this. While our world has grown into a bustling metropolis, we haven't made the strides we should in protecting women. More than 20% of women report being sexually assaulted, but shockingly, only 1 in 10 cases is actually reported to the cops. It's a harsh reality, and it's time to address it. Number 2, there wasn't much education on the topic. Back then, folks were kind of clueless about their own bodies and the dangers of infections. But here's the kicker. Enter the super intriguing marriage manuals from the late 1800s. Sounds fancy, right? Well, not so much. These guides were like treasure chests full of half-truths and old-school beliefs. So get this. These manuals were all about keeping things locked up tight until you tied the knot. They were totally against any kind of self-indulgence. And heaven forbid you use a man's reproductive seed or anything other than making babies. Yeah, they took for better or worse pretty seriously. Now, imagine being in that tangled web of rules and misunderstandings. If you were curious about the nitty-gritty of intimacy, you had to venture into the unknown like a brave explorer. There weren't any textbooks or YouTube tutorials back then, so folks basically went on this wild adventure guided only by their instincts and desires. It was like uncharted waters, full of curiosity. Fast forward to today, where we're swimming in knowledge about relationships and intimacy. We've come a long way from those days of cryptic manuals, but hey, let's not forget where we started. Those whispers from the past remind us of how far we've come and why informed exploration is so important, especially when it comes to matters as personal and essential as matters of the heart. Speaking of personal matters, let's talk about contraception on the American frontier. Pregnancy and childbirth were seriously risky business, but the methods folks had to prevent it were equally dicey. Since condoms were basically luxury items, most women went the extra mile and swallowed abortifacients, aka substances to trigger miscarriages. Spoiler alert, it didn't always work out well. Number 1. Not much oral sex was going on. Back in the Wild West, where things were definitely wild, but not quite as free as you might think. Yep, you guessed it. We're diving into a topic that had the Cowboys raising their brows: oral sex. Maybe the name fellatio just sounded a tad too fancy for their taste, but get this, many folks, including the ladies of the night, thought of it as a bit too French for their liking. Now, picture this. The Wild West was all about the adventure and taking risks, right? But here's the curveball. When it came to oral sex, it was like hunting for a needle in a haystack. In a world where folks were all ready to take on anything, this particular intimate act was like a unicorn, rarely seen. Believe it or not, even the feisty prostitutes, known for their anything-goes attitude, weren't too keen on this whole oral thing. They had a major no trespassing sign when it came to this territory. Some ladies even shunned their fellow workers who dared to venture into this uncharted realm of pleasure. So, amidst all the gunslinging and gold hunting, we've got this unique story. It's like a snapshot of time when people's tastes and what was considered normal drew some interesting lines in the sand. We're talking about a peek into human intimacy in the Wild West, where passions were fiery, but some pleasures were still draped in a mysterious veil of restraint. History sure is something else. Well, there you have it, folks. 10 truly strange and mind-boggling facts about what sex was like in the Wild West. Remember, history is full of fascinating stories waiting to be uncovered. If you want to dive deeper into the intriguing world of the Wild West, we've got you covered. Check out our other videos on the channel. All right, that's it for today. Thanks for watching. See you in the next video.